On today on All About Fitness, I am with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, a professor of exercise science at Lehman College in the Bronx, New York. And I'm holding up a copy of your book, Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy. When was the second edition released? You just came out with the second edition, and I haven't picked it up yet. When did you release the second edition?
Yeah, that's the first edition. The second one came out in June, so about 6 months ago. I'm very proud of it. It has a ton of new content, about 30% new content, and several new chapters added. So pick that one up.
Well, that's what
If you're into hypertrophy, pick that one up.
and that's what I do, Brad. I mean, when I see a new chapter, when I especially and let me make this a little bit more clear, especially with a text like that I believe is like a seminal, like a foundational text. That if people that do what we do and that want to understand how the body responds to exercise, anytime a new edition of a book comes out, they should invest in the money. Do you do the same thing? Am I the only one that does that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends upon what the topic is. So, like in a discipline like muscle hypertrophy, it's a very rapidly evolving field. If it's a standard exercise physiology textbook, there's not that much new that we're figuring out. So it would depend upon, again, really would depend upon what the discipline is. Now, if the exercise physiology book is, let's say, 20 years old, then yeah, then that'd be bad. But we know a lot more. The research was done a lot earlier in that field, where hypertrophy, it's really more of a novel field where it's kind of catching up. And since the 5 years ago when I published the first books, just a ton of new information has come out, new research.
Well, and you're the one doing a lot of the research on that. I mean, in your lab, so obviously you want to be able to feature that. Now, how'd you get interested in the topic of hypertrophy? I mean, when we're all young, we go to the gym because we want big muscles. But as a scientist, how'd you get started down the road of studying hypertrophy?
I mean, that it kind of was personal. So I grew up a real skinny kid and found bodybuilding in my early 20s, and it changed my life. Ultimately, it made a huge difference in my self-esteem. And I then was a personal trainer. I gravitated towards training a lot of people who had those same aspirations. So ultimately, to make a long story short, I started realizing when I got into the scientific aspect, realized how many gaps there were in the literature, that the strength and conditioning field was dominated by research on strength and on power, which for most athletes, that's the primary outcomes, whereas kind of the bodybuilding aspect fell by the wayside. But if you look at most people, when I was a personal trainer, the vast majority of my clients that were coming in weren't saying, my primary goal is to sprint half second faster or to jump an inch higher. They said, I want to look right naked. I want to get bigger muscles. And anyway, it led me to my career as it is now. And it's something I'm really passionate about.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing, Brad, because I just realized, like over this past year, I came up with my second book on how high intensity exercise slows down the aging process. It's called Ageless Intensity. And as I was digging into some of the research on HIIT and high intensity interval training, there's this huge shift. Whereas before the year 2000, about 90% of research on HIIT was done specifically on performance, just what you talked about, that most of the research was done on performance. And it was in the early 2000s with like Marty Gabala's lab and a couple other labs that started looking at HIIT. Can we apply HIIT? They're asking the question, can we apply HIIT to the average population? When we started seeing this big shift in the research literature, is that kind of similar to what happened in the study of hypertrophy? I mean, you said, and I think you're 100% right, I know you're 100% right, is that a majority of the people that walk in the gym, that's their goal. Their goal isn't to sprint 20 meters faster. Their goal is to get bigger muscles. But has there been a big shift in the literature in terms of how it's being studied?
Yeah. So, I mean, there was hypertrophy. Certainly there was hypertrophy research. I'm not saying there was none, but it was mostly kind of an afterthought. Most of it was done in conjunction with the understanding that bigger muscles, it translates into greater strength. So there is a correlation, although it's certainly not a linear correlation between strength and hypertrophy. And there were some labs that were doing some work on it, but most of it was in untrained individuals, and it was just very limited. And I'd like to think that I had a hand in promoting the importance of it. Again, when I came into the field, so this was circa 2010, when I made the transition from being a trainer into an educator researcher. so we're talking 10 years now, really the field was wide open. There's just been a huge shift in terms of the focus now, and just where I think the popularity, the people seeing, researchers seeing how important this is to so many people, has kind of propelled the research, and it continues to grow.
Well,
No,
and the only
no
thing I'm going
pun
to say,
intended.
well, the only thing I'm going to say, Brad, about you writing this book is I've read a lot of your studies, like the stuff that you get that gets published in the Strength and Conditioning Research Journal. So this is kind of a fanboy session for me as well, because I love reading your research, and I'm kind of like, dang it, I could have waited and just read it all at one shot in your book instead of going study by study. But one of the things I want to ask about, because I think, and this is what I got this, I think, from you years ago, but I think you shifted your thought process because once upon a time, did we not believe that light weights and high reps was not really conducive to hypertrophy? And I think some of your work looks specifically at that. Talk a little bit about that, and what did you find in relation to using? Because we hear that gym myth all the time, right? If you want toned muscles, you need to lift with light weights and high reps. What did your research show about that?
Yeah, so it's apropos that you mentioned that, because so much of my research has actually refuted previous beliefs that I've held. It's been quite interesting when you actually carry out your own research and you refute your own hypotheses and your own previously held beliefs. And by the way, that is, to me, that is the essence of what a true scientist does. I'm not about uh, proving what I want to believe. It's about discovery. It's about finding out the truth, seeking the truth, and that's ultimately what research hopefully does. And what you just mentioned has been a real hobby horse of mine topic, where we've done quite a bit of research on the effects of low load training. So we're talking 20 plus reps, 20 plus RM, repetition maximum, and going up 30 plus. And it used to be, when I first came into the field, it was widely believed that anything lower than 65% of your 1 RM, so below about 12 to 15 repetitions, you were basically just doing cardio. That was a function of muscle endurance and cardio, and you weren't going to build any muscles. And what we found, and not only my lab, certainly we've done quite a bit in this area, but multiple other labs have confirmed this, that you can grow larger muscles with a very wide array of loading zones and going up to 40 plus repetitions. And it's similar. The actual hypertrophy is similar to the so-called hypertrophy zone, because it was always thought like your bodybuilding reps or your 8 to 12 for maximum muscle building. And what the literature really shows, I think compellingly now, quite compellingly, is that similar hypertrophy can be attained over a very wide spectrum of loading zones. Now, with that said, I would say that probably from an efficiency standpoint, your hypertrophy zone is what I would recommend the majority of your hypertrophy training be in, if you're looking to maximize growth. Simply because, number one, you spend less time. It has nothing really to do with the load per se, other than you're going to be able to fatigue the muscles, which is requisite to getting larger muscles in a shorter period of time. And also, what I would say is that training with very high repetitions causes a lot of metabolic acidosis, which is not very fun. So adherence, people don't like training with very high reps. It can have negative effects on adherence. But if you want to, and by the way, there are people that have joint related issues, et cetera, and they just can't train with heavier loads. It's a very viable way to maintain or even increase your hypertrophy. So yeah, it's.
Well, I just want to say, Brad, I'm glad you said that about the research because when you read your studies, it comes across very clearly that you went in thinking one way and the outcome of the research led you to go in a different direction. I mean, just so you know that it's very clear in your published studies that kind of happens. And I think that's the really cool thing. And I think you're right, as I think that anything can, as long as the critical point is, I guess the question is, the critical point is reaching fatigue, right? It's not just enough to pick up a light weight and do 20 reps, but doesn't the evidence show that you have to reach a point of fatigue? And how would you define that point? I mean, am I correct in that? And how would you define the point of fatigue?
Yeah, what I would say, I think more succinctly, I would say you need to challenge your muscles beyond their present capacity. And that would involve not necessarily going to all out failure, although I'm not, there might be, that's still an area of contention as to the need to actually train to failure. We have a meta-analysis coming out. I'll give you a heads up and a scoop. It should be out within the next couple of weeks, which really does not show you need to train to failure, but there are gaps in the literature, which, at least to me, especially if you're very elite in terms of your training status, there are some caveats to that. But I think it's quite clear that you need to train close to your fatigue level, failure level. And that means that the muscles are challenged to an extent. And what that fatigue level is, again, is not the research really cannot tell us that at this point. And I think to some extent it will depend somewhat from person to person, have individual factors. I think also you can't necessarily look at it as all versus as a binary, all versus nothing. Let's say all sets at RP of 9, let's say, because you could do one, let's say if you're doing 4 sets of an exercise, you could do one at an RP of 7, one at an RP of 8, one at an RP of 9, and then a set to all out failure. And those are things that just haven't been well studied. So it's not an all or none necessarily phenomenon. And what I would say is quite with a good bit of a surety is that you need to train close to fatigue, close to failure.
And that's the thing. I mean, the funny thing is, Brad, you say this, and this is what bodybuilders have known for years, right? I mean, bodybuilders kind of have decided, large part of that is I think bodybuilders are some of the best scientists, because especially the ones that take notes and keep track of it, because they know it works for them. And I think your work kind of comes along and explains why, right? Is that what, and where I'm going to go with this question is, talk a little bit about the difference between mechanical overload and metabolic overload. Because I think for years, whether you do 10 reps or whether you do 20 reps, either way, you're creating both mechanical and metabolic stress on the tissues. Talk a little bit about what that is, because I really do think that we don't give enough credence to the bodybuilding community for being able to document their work. It just, each one is a study of one, as opposed to a meta-analysis to see how it affects different individuals.
Yeah, so to actually circle back to what you said previously, or what you just said now, and you also said previously, before answering the second question, is that research can help to provide mechanistic answers. So to provide answers as to why, as to the underlying rationale, but also research provides guidelines. So every person should be their own N=1 experiment. There is a wide array of inter-individual differences that are always seen in research, and that people respond differently. And ultimately, people need to use research. Research, what I always say is research provides guidelines. And then people need to be their own N=1 experiment if you're looking to maximize your own results. Now, if you just want decent results, and good results, research can pretty much get you there or close to there. But to really start to optimize results on an individual level, you need to be your own N=1 experiments, and bodybuilders become very good at that for the most part, or they're not good bodybuilders. And then to your subsequent question, what I would say is that mechanical tension, or when you say mechanical fatigue, pure mechanical fatigue without metabolic stress would happen with very low repetition ranges. Let's say with a 1 RM or a 2 RM or 3 RM, where there just is not much metabolic buildup. But mechanical tension per se, every time you're lifting, you're creating mechanical tension. And mechanical tension is the essence, is the most important factor in hypertrophy. So if you're not creating a tension in the muscle, or a stress, mechanical stress within the muscle, there's really no impetus for it, or very little. And I shouldn't say none, because you can actually get some growth even with, it's been shown, with some degree of metabolic stress and or damage. But it's primarily a tension-related phenomenon. Now, the question then becomes, how much does something like metabolic stress contribute as an additive factor? And that we're not sure of it. Certainly, we know that metabolic stress factors related to metabolic stress enter into hypertrophic responses. The question is, are they additive or are they explanatory? So I think this would be beyond the scope of the type of interview we're doing, and it can get quite technical. But metabolic stress is the buildup of metabolites that happen during training. The primary one that most people know about is lactic acid, which causes the burn that's felt. But there's hundreds of metabolites that are that we know of that have been discovered in research.
And,
Exercise-related metabolites.
well, let me ask this question: how do those metabolites refer to, or are they precursors for the anabolic hormones? Because that's some. I mean, again, maybe I'm reading it wrong, or maybe I'm incomplete with that. But my understanding is that sometimes that that acidosis, and the metabolite buildup is a stimulus for like IGF and for insulin growth factors and growth hormone. What's the relationship between that metabolic stress and the anabolic hormones that help build muscle tissue?
So there is a relationship, but there's a relationship between the acute anabolic response, not chronic hormonal response. So metabolic stress has been shown to correlate with the increase in, or the elevations, post-exercise elevations in particular growth hormone and potentially testosterone and IGF-1. Growth hormone is a precursor. It helps to basically, it's a signaler for IGF-1, and that's actually often thought to be its primary anabolic function. But the problem with that thinking is that there really is not much, or the evidence is poor, is weak, that the acute anabolic response to resistance training is involved in the hypertrophic response. It used to be thought that the acute anabolic response had a high degree of correlation. I mean, there is some correlation, but that it had a high degree of applicability to hypertrophy. And more recent research that we have shows that it really doesn't. And I'd be quite confident in saying that if there is an effect, that it would not be much, and that should not be the focus of someone's hypertrophy related training.
It shouldn't be to cause the metabolic stress, but really,
Well, no, that you shouldn't worry about whether your hormones, that you're going to have jacked
okay.
elevations post-exercise. It only lasts about an hour or so. So the
Okay.
elevations post-exercise last roughly an hour. Now, if you're talking about chronic elevations, particularly in testosterone, then there might, but that doesn't happen through metabolic. That's not, training does not seem to have much of an effect on that. And even with that, I would say the studies that even show there might be some chronic elevations, which aren't related to metabolic stress, by the way, the magnitude of those elevations, I'd be skeptical that they have an effect. So just for instance, if your testosterone, the normal testosterone levels are somewhere between 300 to 800. So let's say you're a guy and you have that's for a male. Let's say you have a testosterone level of 500. And let's say that you can get that up to 600 nanograms per deciliter. There's really not much evidence. And that's on a percentage basis. You're talking 20% increase. You say, wow, that's, there's not much evidence that would have a meaningful effect on your muscle building capacity. Now, if you can increase it beyond your normal range, let's say you were able to get it from 500 to 1,000, yeah, that would have an appreciable effect. But there's no evidence that's been shown that can happen.
Okay, but it does, like exercise, like strength training does, and training for hypertrophy does help at least maintain T and GH levels, right, throughout as we get older. I mean, it may not be the significant factor in growth, but it can help maintain regulation of the hormones, or that your body still produces them.
It's not really clear as far as its ability to do that. Certainly, it does upregulate what are called androgen receptor activity, which is another factor. It's not just the hormones, but androgen receptors are what the hormones bind to carry out their effects. So if your androgen receptors are not sensitized and available for the testosterone, you're not going to be able to use your testosterone in ways. So it's more to it. It's a complex process, but it's a lot more nuanced than people think. And to say that it necessarily keeps up testosterone levels, there are plenty of older individuals that have been training for many years and their T levels go down, where aging causes a decrease in T levels, and still not clear what. Now, could that have been we don't, the thing is, you don't know, let's say you take a lifter and you're just looking at correlation, looking at their T levels at a certain period of time. You don't know what their T levels might have been if they didn't train. So anyway, we don't have great info on that.
But then that's the other thing I realized this last year, Brad, is I think you're a couple years older than me. I'm 48, and I don't mean like many years, but I think you're a couple years older. But you really have to. But I think people should really understand that if you're between about 45 and 60, or maybe 65, you're in this generation. If you've been working out for most of your adult life, you're in one of the first generations ever in history that's been exercising throughout the lifespan, right? So there's still a lot. I mean, when I look at it, who's it? Norm Lazarus, I think, is a professor out of England that I'm trying to get on the podcast because he's in his 80s and he writes about this, about how we don't know because we've never had a population of adults in their 50s and 60s this fit and this strong to study before. Is that something you've picked up on at all? I mean, have you seen that kind of correlation?
That, well, absolutely. That we're going to, hopefully now that resistance training is now entrenched as a very important tool for anti-aging tool, and that the baby boomer generation who has grown up with that understanding is now getting older and getting into their senior years, that we'll be able to study that to a greater degree. But it's certainly a topic that really warrants a lot more study. And look, we certainly know that resistance training, there's no question whatsoever. There is no better pill than
Yeah.
resistance training because it has no downside, zero downside side effects. And there's a ton of positive side effects. But whether there are certain things we still that are remain to be understood, like how it affects certain hormonal, outcomes and other things. So I think we will be learning a lot more. The effects of resistance training are still in its infancy. And so much of our understanding of exercise in general, the research, although look, most of the research pre 2000 or so, or certainly, I would say, certainly the majority of it was on cardiovascular training.
Hmm.
So it's really with the turn of the century where we just had an explosion in resistance training research. And I would say over the last 10 years, it's just really gone through the roof. So we're going to be learning a lot more over the next decade or two, and we'll have a lot more answers.
Well, it'll keep you busy. Two more questions, then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
One is on the role of glycogen depletion because you talk about metabolic, the high level metabolic stress, and I think listeners should understand that muscle growth, because the reason why I asked the question about hormones is some people might think that muscle growth comes from hormones, but the other thing is if you deplete glycogen in muscle cells, isn't the primary adaptation storing more glycogen? And glycogen holds on to water. What role does that play in terms of muscle growth? What role does like kind of the repletion cycle play in long-term hypertrophy and muscle growth?
So you might be asking or I'll answer this in two ways because I'm not clear on which way you're going with this, but there is, now if you're on a low carb diet, there is some evidence. So where your glycogen levels are always depleted. Glycogen is an anabolic signaler, or it's an anti-catabolic signaler at least, because when you deplete glycogen, you increase what's called AMPK. Now on an acute level, it really doesn't show much effect because once you start eating carbohydrates, you replete your glycogen. But if you're on one of the thoughts is whereby a ketogenic diet is not probably the best muscle building diet is because if glycogen levels are chronically depleted, your AMPK levels are chronically elevated, and AMPK antagonizes anabolic signaling and something called mTOR in particular, which is a primary anabolic signaler. So having glycogen repleted is to some extent an important factor. Now you can still, I don't want to say that you're not going to build muscle on a ketogenic diet, you clearly can, but it probably is not, at least from the preliminary evidence we have, the best diet for muscle building, for maximum muscle building. And we still need more research there. But on the other side of the coin, glycogen, as you mentioned, does hold water. So for each gram of glycogen, which is, for those who don't know, it's stored carbohydrate within muscle and also in the liver, but primarily the muscle. And it attracts anywhere between 3 to 4 grams of water. So when you deplete glycogen, you get flat, your muscles shrivel to some extent. And then when you replete your glycogen, you it will in effect hold water. It will draw water into the cell. Bodybuilders do this all the time with carb deplete carb load cycles pre-contest, where they end up being able to look fuller. Their muscles look bigger because they deplete carbs. Then they have a super compensation of carb loading, where they get more water into their muscle. Now, that's not, when you talk about permanent, it's only as permanent as your glycogen repletion goes. But
Yeah.
technically, the more glycogen you could store in your muscle, the greater your capacity to hold more water in the muscle, and the more full your muscles will look. So that is called, for those who are savvy in the industry, it's partial. It's a form of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and it's not a permanent adaptation, but certainly it's something that can make you look more jacked while you're holding the water.
Yeah, well, and that explains why you see. I mean, because bodybuilders, it's brown rice, sweet potatoes, and water is the formula for muscle growth. And the reason that's the primary reason why I asked that was to get people realizing that relationship between carbohydrate and muscle growth. Because I think a lot of people are on these ketogenic diets. And respect your time today. The final question, and this is kind of not a huge segue, but is occlusion training. I think you've written a little bit about occlusion training. I'm not sure if I've read if you've studied it. Maybe I'm
Oh yeah, we've had
misremembering it, but
quite a few
let's
studies.
because I first heard about this 15 years ago, and I think it's what Katsu was the methodology. And occlusion training is one of those things, Brad, I see pop up every few years as kind of like it kind of percolates up. Somebody kind of makes it popular, and so talk a little bit about what occlusion training is and what the benefits might be for muscle growth, whether they're short term or whether it's something you can do for the long run.
Yeah, so occlusion training involves putting a cuff on the proximal portion, so the upper portion of a muscle. So let's say you want to work your biceps, you would put the cuff above the biceps, so at the just on the deltoid level. And the idea is to cut off or to occlude the venous. You want to prevent you want to prevent blood from leaving the muscle, allow blood to come into the muscle through the arteries, but prevent it through the veins. And there it still is somewhat occluded arterially as well. But basically, it causes what's called a hypoxic effect. So you're reducing the oxygen supply, and it's not clear why, but we have a ton of evidence on it now that shows that it is effective. So you use very light loads. As a general rule, you use like 20 to 30% of your 1 RM. So somewhere between 25, 30 reps down to 15 reps. And ultimately, it's been shown to be quite effective in promoting muscle growth. And interestingly, I mean, this study showing that walking, if you let's say use occlusion training on the upper thigh, that it actually can have some effects in untrained individuals in muscle growth. Mechanisms are still what unclear. Metabolic stress has been one that has been put forth. Cell swelling is another, because it has the effect of what's called reactive hyperemia, where you get this rush of blood into the muscle, and that the pooling of blood acutely might drive the hypertrophic response. The hypoxia in itself is thought, so the lack of oxygen is thought maybe to cause certain upregulation of certain substances in the muscle. We're not clear. Now, the caveats to this are that it's only really good for the extremities. So if you can't tie off your chest and your
Yeah, I
back,
was just thinking, yeah, you wouldn't be able to do
or
that.
your
Yeah.
glutes, so basically it's for your thighs, your calves, your upper arms and your forearms you can use it for. Um, and with that, it can be very effective for rehab. We've used it in rehab settings. Uh, it is not, to me, it's really an adjunct to a full training program. And I do think that it, it, it can help, particularly when I say particularly, certainly for bodybuilders, if you're looking to focus on hypertrophy. One of the things that it has been shown that there's some emerging evidence on is that it can target your type 1 muscle fibers. So briefly, there are two types of fibers: type 1, which are your endurance oriented fibers, and type 2, which are your strength oriented fibers. The type 2 fibers, in general, traditional resistance training, tend to get greater growth through traditional training. So the fact that you can perhaps target your type 1 fibers would be an additive effect that might be a reason why you might want to add it, particularly if your goal is maximal hypertrophy.
Interesting. And the final thing is, I think no matter what, because you've talked about low load, high rep, you've talked about this, and I think the main thing is from the literature, Brad, is change things up on a regular basis, right? Is that's the role of periodization. How often should people change their program? And I know that you always like to look at data, so that's a very bold or very wide question. But just in general, for people in the gym, general consumers looking just to get a little stronger, a little more muscle growth, about how often should they change up their rep and loading schemes?
That's a question. So when you ask a question like that, my answer is always going to be, it depends. There's so
Yeah.
many factors. And by the way, you can use an undulating type of routine where you're changing it up really every workout. So you can do a high rep day and a moderate rep day. So Monday can be your high rep day. Wednesday can be your, Monday can be your high rep day. Wednesday, your moderate rep day, and Friday, your low rep day. And when you're asking questions like that, that involves an objective and a
timeline.
Exactly. You need to
Yeah.
plan out what you're looking to do and why and what your goals are. So there's too many factors that go into that for me to give you a cookie cutter answer. I know people want that type of thing, but
Yeah,
it really
exactly.
does a disservice when answering that if you can't give an accurate answer.
And but in all honesty, I'm glad we're finishing on that, because I want people to understand that if you ask somebody that, I mean, Brad, there aren't many people in the industry that really know muscle growth at the level that you do. And the fact that the more, and what I've found repeatedly is the more that somebody knows, the less definitive answer they can provide. And because you just don't know. But the whole reason why I ask that question is I want people to understand they just need to change it they can't always do the same rep scheme and loading scheme all the time, that there should be some variation in there.
I would certainly concur with that. And variation in this, variation in exercises, variation in loading schemes. So there's quite a bit to unpack with that.
Well, and if they want to get more, and I'm gonna hold up for viewers on YouTube, I'm holding up. This is the first edition, Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy, the Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy, and the second edition is out now. And what I'm going to do, Brad, is have a link down below, not only but to the Human Kinetics page, because for listeners, I really want people to know that buying directly from the publisher, and Human Kinetics is my publisher as well, buying directly from the publisher is better for the author, because if it's discounted on other large retailers, it comes out of our back end. So I will have the link directly to the Human Kinetics page, just because, I mean, A, it's a great book, and B, I want to be able to promote your work and what you've been doing. So, hey, I appreciate your time, Brad. And where can people, you have a blog, and where can people get more information just to stay up to date on what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all over. So what my website is Look Great Naked, and it's great, not good, because I've heard bad things about the site. So it's
Look Great Naked.
Look Great Naked is my website, and I have a blog, which I need to start updating a little now, but I'm all over social media. I mean, just search me, but I'm on, my primary ones are Twitter and Instagram. I'm also on Facebook, although with their algorithms, I've done less with that recently. But can't thank you enough for having me on, Pete, and hopefully I've educated the audience.
Hey, this is perfect, and hopefully you survive the snowstorm. Hi, I'm Pete McCall, and welcome to this episode of All About Fitness for YouTube. This is really going to be a fun episode because this is a fanboy episode for me, and I mean this. I first heard this guest speak a number of years ago at a fitness conference, one or two fitness conferences in the New York area when he was a personal trainer, and somewhere along the way he picked up a PhD. He's been a researcher. He has a great blog called Look Great, or a great website called Look Great Naked. But if you exercise because you want big muscles, if you exercise because you want to look better, because whether you walk on a stage or whether you just want to look better in your social media posts, you have to understand the science of what's called hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is a technical word for muscle growth. You might want to call it swole, you might want to call it get jacked, whatever you want to call it. The fact is, there's a specific science to how muscles grow. And the guest today wrote the book, literally wrote the book, Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy. It's Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. And Brad, I'm actually holding up, for viewers, I'm actually holding up the first edition, but the second edition came out in mid-2020. I haven't picked it up yet. We talk a little bit about that. But Brad's a research geek. He's also a practitioner, But in reality, Brad is a research geek. He's done a tremendous amount of research. I've read over the years, I can't tell you how many studies I've read of his that have really influenced my work. And anytime I do a lot of writing, I just wrote my second book. I do a lot of writing for organizations in the fitness industry. And when I'm starting to write about strength or muscular development or muscle growth, Brad's the first guy I go to. And I mean that. I go to Google Scholar. I look up to see what he's published recently. I go to his website, Look Great Naked. I refer to his book. That's why I need to pick up the second edition, because he studies this stuff. We have a brief talk today about the science of muscle growth. And the one thing that I really, really appreciate about researchers like Brad, and you'll hear this at the end of the conversation, I really invite you to wait to the end of the conversation, is you understand why it's important to hear from a researcher. Because the more that somebody knows, the less they can give you, the less definitive answer they can give you. Whereas what it seems to be in the fitness industry is the less that somebody knows, they'll say, you got to do this, you got to do that. There's no you gotta. Now, the one thing you do got to do is hit subscribe down below, because I'm starting to post a lot more of my interviews on the All About Fitness podcast YouTube channel. Hit like if you like this interview with Brad. You're going to learn a ton about muscle growth. You can go to my website, PeteMcCallFitness.com. Sign up for my blog. I'm going to put out about two issues of my blog a month where I update you on the science of exercise and aging. That's what I'm doing here. I'm helping you understand how to use exercise to slow down the aging process. On this interview today, I interviewed Dr. Brad Schoenfeld about muscle growth. Again, one more time, hit subscribe, hit like. You're going to dig this stuff. I know it. You're going to enjoy it. But today, Brad and I talk about muscle growth, the science of muscle growth, what makes your muscles grow, how you can get your muscles grow, and great conversation. For more information, pick up a copy of his book. I'll show it right here. Again, the second edition is out. This is Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy. There's going to be a link down below, so check down below for the link. And really, here we go. Great interview, fascinating topic about how muscles grow. And remember, when it comes to research, the best study is a study of one, and that's you. So take the information that Brad provides, read his book, see how it applies to you, see how you can use it to change your workout programs, because the evidence is the evidence, but everybody's going to react to it in a different way to it. So here we go, All About Fitness podcast with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld.